So, what's Fiat all about? Let's talk about pieces of paper. Before I started this video, I checked the type of pieces of paper I have, and I brought some with me to show you. I obviously have the Israeli shekel. That's one piece of paper we use here in Israel if you want to buy something. I have here, let's see, what is this? This is the Swiss franc. Yes, Switzerland. That's the papers they use in Switzerland. And this would be a peso. In Argentina, I have something here on the floor, of course, yes. The euro. That's another piece of paper. That's the story of Fiat. These are just pieces of paper. These are pieces of paper that can be printed by central banks, each in his own country. The same pieces of paper that people labor for. And the central banks and governments print them a lot faster than anyone can work for. And that system can continue until the gap in life becomes so intolerable that people refuse. In fact, I'm sure that in 30 years from now, people are going to look and they were going to ridicule our Federal Reserve System or the Fiat system, where people trust their value and labor in pieces of paper. And the reason people are going to ridicule is not because they're going to be smarter than us. It's just simply because they're going to have the retrospective. They've seen or they know about the collapse. In 2020, what is it? 21. It hasn't happened yet, even though we all know these pieces of paper are just that, and they're not going to hold their value. In my previous video, I spoke about what gives money, these pieces of paper, fiat, its value. And I concluded that it's the people who produce within the society, those who make stuff that other people want. And another thought about fiat, if you take countries that have a lot of resources, these are most likely countries you wouldn't want to live in as a regular citizen. And why is that? You see, in Israel, for example, our main export is technology. We have a lot of engineers, software engineers, and that's most of our export. And politicians and central banks, for that matter, are dependent on the population, those who produce. And they need to satisfy their needs and wants if they wish to maintain their salaries or the value of their salaries. So while government can decide what their pay is, the worth of these pieces of paper are determined by those who produce. And since the government is dependent on those who produce, we have some checks and balances. When you have countries that have raw resources that they can export, and they can derive the value of the pieces of paper they print from these exports, they are less dependent on the population. And, obviously, since that is the case, you would see a huge gap between rich and poor and between government objectives and people wants and needs. The fiat system is responsible for everything, basically, since every action we do involves fiat. I heard a criticism about Milton Friedman that in his eyes, from wars to corruption to unemployment to everything is the fault or the result of central banks. And obviously, I couldn't agree more. If we people give value to pieces of paper, the people who print, who have the power to print as much pieces of paper as they want, are godlike. They can decide what has value and what doesn't have value, what needs to be produced and what not needs to be produced. Every time they subsidize something, they make more of it. And sometimes, in fact, many times, they subsidize things that we freely did not want to subsidize. In fact, by definition, that is the case. Central banks and governments are always counter to what is. You see, we are free people. We have doctors and engineers, and we have people exchanging value for value. And it is the intervention of governments that wish to change whatever it is they wish to change by printing money and allocating to certain groups of the population hoping to change their behaviors. So in my previous videos, I've mentioned that the Federal Reserve job is to decide what people do or control what people do when they wake up in the morning. It has tools to do that. It is interest rates, buying bonds, selling bonds, and deciding the reserve that banks should have. And by doing so, they change people's behavior according to how they think people should behave. And these new tools that the Federal Reserve is always referring to is other ways for them to print pieces of paper and give it to different entities than the one they give it up till now. So if up till now they were able to give pieces of paper to banks, and banks took over and lent it to the people with huge gains, today banks don't do that. So the Federal Reserve tries to find new tools, so new ways of buying things through BlackRock, which is a private company, to buy things that under its mandate it cannot, and so on and so forth. So the Fiat system is a system where the power, instead of being reserved and kept by those who produced, is transferred to bureaucrats who redistribute to these pieces of paper according to their belief, instead of free voluntary cooperation, exchanging value for value between free people. So let's talk money creation. What are the rules in which these pieces of paper can be printed? Well, fractional reserve system. Most money, most pieces of paper are created in the banks when you take a loan. Specifically, by the Federal Reserve mandate, banks, for our purposes, can lend 10 times as much as they have. Now, they do not create money in the bank. Physically, they don't print it in the bank. So how can they lend 10 times as much? That is the fractional reserve system, and it's pretty simple. There is $1,000 that is the only 1,000 pieces of paper out there, and the first person comes into the bank and gives it to the bank for safekeeping. The bank then lends that money, 90% of that money, because it has to hold 10%, to someone else. That someone else does something with that money, buys something, and whoever gets it brings it back to the bank. Okay, and that's how money is created. You see, now that money can be lent again, 90% of that, and so on and so forth. So it's the same $1,000, since they're all the time returning to the bank, and we're looking at the banking system as one, then it's the same money multiplied. In fact, the main problem that banks have is that people don't create enough money. And again, how does it come about? You sit with your banker and you convince him with words, with charts, that what you wish to do would enable you to receive more pieces of paper from other free people. So if your bank would lend you 1,000 or 1,000,000 pieces of paper, you'll be able to build something, organize people in such a way that other people would give their pieces of paper, and that would add up to be a lot more than 1,000,000 pieces of paper. If the bank is convinced, he gives you that loan. Once he gives you that loan, he created money. The absurdity in our system, specifically since we don't have sound money, and that's really the whole trick. Since we don't have sound money, the bankers who give you that loan, in the end of the year, they see how much money they need to put into the economy in order to accommodate for the loan they gave. It's circular. Let me give you another example to solidify this idea. Let's say you're one of those billionaires. You want to build a building which is 120 stories high. These are many billions of pieces of paper you would need to have the bank lend you in order to build it and pay all the employees and the raw materials and so on. Having said that, the calculation you should do is you need to figure out how many pieces of paper it costs to build this structure, this building, and how many pieces of paper. And here comes the point. You're speculating on how many pieces of paper will be out there in 5-10 years when the building will be done, when it will be built. That's the bet you're making. And how many pieces of paper out there are dependent on the process I just explained. How many people will go to the bank and how many banks will be convinced and create more pieces of paper. Now, 10 years have passed and you've guessed wrong. It cost you many billions of pieces of paper, and for some reason people do not wish to live or rent these offices or resident, whatever you built. And they're willing to give you a lot less pieces of paper. In this case, what happens? Everyone who gave you pieces of paper loses his money. And then this building is sold. And he is sold to whomever gives most pieces of paper. And that person would look at how many pieces of paper there are today, and according to that, he would give a price. And whoever is going to give an estimate, that's going to be based on how many pieces of paper are actually existent, and not how much that billionaire predicted there will be 10 years from now, or from when he started. Now, why is it important? Because you see, how many pieces of paper is something that is not done by the free market. It is done by central banks. The central banks who know how much they've lent to that billionaire, and they make sure they accommodate for that billionaire by printing more pieces of paper, diluting the value of the savers. And it makes a society in which those who think big, those who are pretty much insane in many ways, are megalomaniacs, people who are distinguished from others. When they have $1 million, unlike us, they think, oh, I'm going to buy myself an apartment. They think, oh, how do I leverage this to 20 and buy something huge? And since these people are accommodated by our central bank, since we don't have a sound money system in which pieces of paper or whatever there is out there which we exchange and we call money is not determined by the free exchange of people, but rather by bureaucrats, central bankers, academics, and again, not the free people. And it distorts our entire financial system. I say, and I've made a video about money being a language, and it distorts our language. And that was the point I was making. The fiat system is a terrible system, specifically working for pieces of paper that other people, unaccountable, in the sense that they don't lose or gain anything from their actions, because they get a salary from government and it is independent of the results. That is not the society we want to live in. We work for pieces of paper and they print as much as they like. And they might do it out of good intentions. But anytime you use force, and that's all it is when you print pieces of paper, okay? You do not, today in our modern society, in the fiat system, you do not need to go and rob someone of his gold or his the sheeps that he has, or whatever textile or whatever food that he makes. You can simply print and steal the purchasing power of everyone without using force which is visible, but you're most certainly using force. And the fiat system allows it. So, to end this video, I'll give an advice. What you want is to convert whatever pieces of paper you have into something that you think that in 10 years, or whatever your time horizon is, people will value. Something people would want. And if you think that people would want these pieces of paper, well, you're against history, and in my judgment, against common sense. So, till next time.